The auction block reeked of salt, tar, and fear, and Murak Mudborn stood upon it with her wrists bound in cold iron, refusing to let her knees bend for anyone. Chains rattled at her ankles as the crowd pressed closer beneath the gray morning sky of Bridgewatch, a border town built where the wagon roads met the sea. Vendors had abandoned their stalls of salted fish and wool to watch the war prize sail, and their eyes crawled over her the way carrion birds studied a dying animal. She was tall even among her own kind, her shoulders broad with muscle earned at a forge rather than a battlefield alone, and the tattered remains of her battle leathers. A fitted cuirass of dark hide laced tight over her chest and trousers cut close to powerful legs still bore the scorch marks of the skirmish that had ended in her capture 3 days past. Her tusks were short and neat, filed by her own hand, and her green-gray skin was marked with the pale lines of old scars she wore like a ledger of survival. She did not lower her golden eyes from the auctioneer's smug face, not even when his whip-thin assistant jabbed her ribs with a spear butt to make her turn for the crowd's inspection. "A prize of the Northern Campaign," the auctioneer called, his voice oiled with false cheer. "Orc-forged steel in her blood, good bidders, strong back, strong hands tamed easy enough with the right collar. Who will open the bidding for the Shiork?" Murak spat at his boots. The crowd laughed, ugly and delighted, and she felt the old fury coil low in her belly, the fury she had learned to leash rather than loose, because loosed fury only earned the lash. She had lost the battle. She had not lost herself. That was the vow she repeated in the dark of the cage wagon each night since her capture. "They can chain my hands. They cannot chain what I am." A voice from the crowd's edge, oiled and cruel in a different way, called out the opening bid, and Murak's stomach turned to find its source. Lord Aldrich Vance sat his gray gelding at the crowd's fringe, a border lord with a taste for spectacle, his velvet collar too fine for a market town, his smile too wide for a man buying only labor. He meant her for his fighting pits. She knew it the way she knew a blade's temper by its ring. She had heard the stories of orc prisoners made to fight starving wolves, and each other for the amusement of men who had never held a sword in true battle. The bidding rose, coin by coin, and Murak kept her chin high even as despair tried to crawl up her throat, because a proud death in the pits was better than a life spent as an ornament of another man's cruelty, but even that grim comfort was thin. Then a new voice cut through the murmuring crowd, rough at the edges, unpolished and entirely unafraid. 12 silver crowns. The crowd turned as one. Murak turned too, and found the voice belonged to a man who did not look like he belonged among the silk-collared bidders at all. He was broad through the shoulders in the particular way of men who had spent years swinging a hammer, his forearms corded with muscle, and streaked with old soot that no washing ever fully lifted, his simple leather apron still hanging loose around his neck, as though he had run from his forge without thinking to remove it. His hair was dark and unruly, his jaw rough with a day's stubble, and his eyes, when they met hers across the market square, held none of the hunger or contempt she had grown used to. They held something else entirely, something that looked absurdly like an apology. 12 crowns, the auctioneer repeated, startled. "That is every coin you carry, blacksmith, unless my eyes deceive me." "Every coin I have," the man agreed. "And it is more than that pit lord offered." Lord Vance's mouth thinned. 15, he snapped, irritated now, and the man in the leather apron did not so much as blink. "I do not have 15, he said, "but I have my forge, and my forge is worth more than that to any smith in this town who owes me a favor. Give me 1 hour and I will bring you 15 in silver honest coin, if you will hold the bid." The auctioneer, sensing a spectacle that would be talked about in taverns for a month, grinned and looked to Lord Vance. The lord, unwilling to be seen haggling over a slave with a common blacksmith before half the town, waved a dismissive hand and turned his horse away in a huff of wounded pride, muttering that the orc was diseased-looking regardless. It was a lie, and everyone knew it, but it let him leave with his dignity, and Murak found she did not care why the wolf left so long as it left. The blacksmith did not need the hour. He returned within a quarter of it, breathless, with a leather purse heavier than his own good sense, and counted 15 silver crowns into the auctioneer's palm with hands that trembled slightly, whether from exertion or nerves Murak could not yet tell. "Simon Sullivan," the auctioneer said, reading the name off the man's token of citizenship with some amusement. "You have yourself an orc." Simon Sullivan did not look pleased by the phrase. He looked, if anything, faintly sick. He climbed the 2 wooden steps to the block himself rather than sending his assistant, and when he reached her, he did not grab her chain the way the auctioneer's man had. He simply stood before her, close enough that she could smell the coal smoke and iron on him, and said, quiet enough that only she could hear it over the dispersing crowd, "I am not going to hurt you. I bought your chain, not you. The moment we are clear of this square, I am cutting it." Murak studied his face for the lie she expected to find there. She found none. That, more than the coin he had spent, unsettled her most of all. "Why?" she said, her voice low and rough with disuse, the common tongue of humans sitting strangely in her mouth after days of silence. "Why spend everything you own on an orc you do not know?" Simon Sullivan looked almost embarrassed by the question, as though he had not fully worked out the answer himself. "Because nobody should be sold like a plow horse," he said finally. "Not you, not anyone." He led her from the square himself, his hand never once closing around her arm the way it might have on the wrist of a beast he feared might bolt, and Murak Mudborn walked beside him with her chain still on and her mind, for the first time in 3 days, no longer entirely consumed with plans for her own death. The road out of Bridgewatch ran along the coast for the better part of the afternoon, past salt marshes and wind-bent pines, until it narrowed to a spine of packed shell and stone that the locals called the Spit. Simon explained as they walked that it was a causeway, passable only at low tide, connecting the mainland to a rocky headland the townsfolk called Saltcairn, where his forge and cottage stood alone above the gray water. "Cut off twice a day," he said, glancing at the darkening tide line as though gauging their remaining time. "Comes in fast here. A man can drown checking his own front step if he is not watching the water." "You live alone on an island that tries to kill you," Murak said, "and yet you spent your fortune on a stranger who could break your neck before you drew your next breath." Simon actually laughed at that, a short surprised bark of a sound. "When you put it that way, I do sound like a fool." "You are a fool," Murak agreed, but there was no venom in it, only the exhausted honesty of a woman who had expected a whip and been given, instead, an outstretched hand and a joke. He stopped at the narrowest point of the causeway, where the sea hissed close on both sides, and drew a small iron file from his apron pocket. He knelt, without being asked, and set to work on the rivet of her ankle chain, his broad hands surprisingly deft with the small tool, his head bowed so close to her that she could count the gray hairs beginning at his temples, though he could not have seen more than 30 summers. "There is a smithy on Saltcairn," he said as he worked, "bigger than the whole of Bridgewatches, if you can believe it. My father built it. I am the only one who tends it now. You will have your own room, your own door that locks from the inside, and you will leave whenever you please, tide allowing. I only ask that you let a physician look at that gash on your shoulder before it festers." The chain fell away from her ankle with a soft clink into the shallow water, and Murak Mudborn felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since the moment of her capture. She did not thank him. Orcs did not thank easily, and gratitude, in her experience, was a debt that men liked to collect on in cruel ways. But she did not pull away when he moved to the manacles at her wrists, either, and when those too fell into the tide, she flexed her fingers slowly, testing the ache from days of confinement, and found Simon Sullivan watching her with something that was not fear and was not pity, but a kind of careful, curious respect. "You could run," he said. "Tide is low enough. You could be 3 miles inland before it turns." "I could," Murak agreed. She did not move. "Why do you stay?" he asked, echoing her own question back to her, and there was a boyish uncertainty in it that made him look, for a moment, younger than his years. Murak considered the wide gray sea, the empty road behind them leading back to a market town that had tried to sell her like livestock, and the strange, sooty, big-shouldered man kneeling in the surf before her with an iron file still in his hand. "Because a fool who spends his fortune to free a stranger," she said, "is either the best man I have ever met or the worst liar, and I find I would like to learn which before I run anywhere at all." They walked the rest of the causeway together as the water began, slowly, to rise around their ankles. Saltcairn proved to be exactly as Simon had promised, a wind-scoured knuckle of rock crowned by a squat stone cottage, and, dwarfing it, a smithy of blackened timber and iron with a chimney that had clearly been rebuilt more than once against the coastal gales. The forge fire had gone cold in his haste to reach the market, and the first thing Murak did upon entering, before she had even asked where she might sleep, was cross to the bellows and examine the coal bed with the practiced eye of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "Your coal is wet," she said, disapproving. "You have been storing it against the seaward wall." Simon blinked at her. "It is the only wall with a roof over it." "Then you are ruining good coal for the sake of a dry roof over your head instead of over your fuel," Murak said, and there was something almost pleasurable in the bluntness of the argument, a return to a language she understood far better than the language of markets and chains. "Where I come from, the forge master would have you mucking the yard for a season for such waste." "Is that so?" Simon said, and there was a spark of challenge in his tired eyes now, the first real fire she had seen in him since the auction block. "And where you come from, do the forge masters make blades that hold an edge through 3 winters of use, or do they just complain about coal storage?" Murak's tusked mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, not yet, but was close kin to one. "I was my clan's second bladesmith before a human spear found my shoulder in a fight I should have won. I have forged steel that could split your human iron like kindling." "Bold claim," Simon said, "from a woman who has been standing in my smithy for the length of one conversation." "Bold and true," Murak said. "Give me a week in coal that has not been left to rot in sea air, and I will show you." Simon Sullivan looked at her for a long moment, weighing something behind his eyes, and then he laughed again, warmer this time, and gestured toward the forge with an open hand. "Then let us see whose steel holds an edge, Murak Mudborn. Winner keeps the last word in every argument for a month." "You will regret those terms," Murak said, and meant it as a promise rather than a threat, and felt, for the first time since the spear had taken her down on the battlefield 3 days before, something that was almost like joy. The week that followed changed the shape of Murak's days entirely. She had come to Saltcairn expecting to be a captive in all but name, a curiosity to be tolerated or a burden to be resented, and instead found herself standing at a forge from dawn, until the tide claimed the causeway each evening, arguing with Simon Sullivan over quench times, and hammer weights with an intensity that left them both sweat-soaked and grinning by midday. She discovered that he was a stubborn man, slow to anger but slower still to yield a point he believed in, and that his hands, though rougher and less certain than her own at the finer work of shaping a blade's spine, had a patience to them that she had rarely seen even among her own clan's finest smiths. He discovered, in turn, that she laughed more easily than her fearsome reputation suggested, a short, sharp bark of amusement that she seemed almost embarrassed by each time it escaped her, and that she took a fierce, undisguised pride in her own skill that never once curdled into cruelty toward his lesser experience. Their contest began as a genuine rivalry. Murak forged a hunting blade with a wave pattern folded into the steel the way her clan smiths had taught her, and Simon studied it with something like awe before setting to work on his own answer, a broad, short sword balanced for a farmer's hand rather than a soldier's, practical where hers was beautiful. When they tested the blades against a hanging deer carcass brought over from the mainland market, hers cut cleaner, but has held its edge through twice as many strikes, and they argued about which quality mattered more late into the night by the light of the banked forge, sitting closer together on the workshop bench than either of them quite seemed to notice at first. It was on the fourth evening of this contest, both of them laughing over the ale Simon had bartered a mended plow blade for, that Murak realized how easily she had begun to look forward to the sound of his voice, and how carefully she had begun to watch the movement of his hands at the anvil, not for the quality of his craft alone. "You are staring," Simon said, not unkindly, catching her gaze across the firelight. "I am assessing your form," Murak said. "Your grip on the hammer favors your right shoulder too heavily. It will cost you strength in a year's time." "Is that truly what you were assessing?" Simon asked, and there was a boldness in the question that surprised them both, a boldness he seemed to regret the moment it left his mouth, color rising in his soot-streaked face. "Forgive me, that was forward." "It was," Murak agreed. She did not look away. "You are forward more often than I expected of you, blacksmith. And you have not once told me to stop," Simon pointed out quietly. Murak Mudborn, who had faced human spears and orc chieftains, and the auction block without flinching, found herself unable to answer that with anything but silence, and the silence between them stretched long and warm and dangerous in the firelight until the tide horn sounded from the mainland, some fisherman's warning of the turning water, and broke the spell before either of them dared to close the distance further. Not every day on Saltcairn was so gentle. Word of the strange arrangement, an orc war prize living free in a human blacksmith's home, traveled the coast road faster than the tide itself, and within a fortnight Simon found himself the subject of ugly muttering whenever he crossed the causeway to trade at Bridgewatch's market. Murak insisted on accompanying him on one such trip, tired of hiding on the headland like something shameful, and the decision nearly ended in blood. They were haggling over a delivery of coal at the market's edge when a knot of dockworkers, Drinkloud despite the early hour, began calling out cruelties meant to be heard. One of them, a broad man with a fisherman's hook scar across his cheek, stepped directly into Murak's path and spat at her feet. "An orc walking free in a decent town," he sneered, "ought to be back in chains where it belongs, not strutting about like it is one of us." "She is not in it," Simon said, stepping between them before Murak could so much as draw breath to answer for herself, his voice low and hard in a way she had not yet heard from him. "And she is worth 10 of any man fool enough to spit at her boots." "Careful, blacksmith," the dockworker said, "or folk will start wondering if you have taken an orc to your bed as well as your forge." Murak felt the old fury rise, quick and hot, and this time she did not leash it. She stepped around Simon before he could stop her, closing the distance to the dockworker in 2 strides that made the whole crowd flinch back, and set one broad green hand flat against his chest, not striking, simply pressing, until he stumbled back a full pace under the sheer weight of her strength. "If I wished to hurt you," she said, low and clear enough for the gathering crowd to hear every word, "you would already be on the ground counting your teeth. I do not hurt cowards for sport. I only ask that cowards learn to keep their mouths as still as their courage." The crowd's ugly murmuring faltered, uncertain now whether to laugh or flee, and it was Simon who broke the tension, stepping up beside Murak with his hand resting briefly, warmly, at the small of her back in a gesture that was not quite possessive and not quite protective, but was entirely, unmistakably a statement of where he stood. "The coal delivery," he said to the merchant, as though nothing at all had happened. "I will take it Thursday as agreed." They walked back across the causeway in silence that evening, the tide already licking at the stones, and it was Murak who finally spoke, watching the mainland recede behind them with something unreadable in her golden eyes. "You did not need to stand so close to danger for my sake," she said. "I have faced worse than drunk fishermen." "I know you have," Simon said. "I did not stand there for your sake alone. I stood there because I did not like what he said about you, and I did not like what he implied about me, and mostly I stood there because I wanted to." Wanted to defend me or wanted to stand close to me? Murak asked, and there was a teasing edge to it now, testing him the way she might test the temper of a new blade. Simon Sullivan looked at her for a long moment, the wind off the sea pulling at his dark hair, and did not look away this time. Both, he admitted. I'm not sure there is a difference anymore where you are concerned. The words hung between them, too honest for either of them to laugh off, and Murak found herself reaching out before she had fully decided to, her calloused fingers brushing the line of his jaw, rough with stubble and soot, tilting his face toward hers. This is forbidden, she said, though she did not pull away, for both our kinds. Your people would call it unnatural. Mine would call it a betrayal of clan blood. I have never much cared what other people call things, Simon said, his voice unsteady but his gaze steady as forge fire. What do you call it? Dangerous, Murak said. I call it dangerous, Simon Sullivan. And then, because danger had never once in her life made her turn away from a thing she wanted, she closed the last inches between them and kissed him. There on the narrow spine of stone, with the sea rising cold around their ankles and the gulls screaming overhead. And Simon Sullivan, blacksmith of Saltcairn, kissed her back like a man who had been waiting his whole overlooked, lonely life for exactly this, and had never quite let himself believe it would come. They made it back across the causeway with only moments to spare before the tide closed the road, laughing breathlessly, hands still tangled together. And if the villagers of Bridgewatch had ugly words for what they had witnessed at the market, neither Murak nor Simon gave those words another thought that night. The weeks that followed were the happiest Simon Sullivan could remember since his father's death had left him alone with the forge and the empty cottage, and the long silences of a man with no family left to speak of. Murak's presence filled Saltcairn in a way he had not known it was lacking until she came. She sang low working songs in her clan's tongue while she hammered, rough and strange and beautiful to his ears. She teased him mercilessly over his stubborn attachment to old smithing methods, and then studied his methods with genuine fascination when he explained the reasoning behind them. She fell asleep some evenings against his shoulder by the banked forge fire, exhausted from honest work, and woke each time startled and fierce for half a heartbeat before she remembered where she was and who she was beside, and the tension would melt from her shoulders, and she would settle back against him with a low, contented sound that he treasured more than any coin he had ever earned. Their forging contest never truly ended, because neither of them wanted it to. It became instead the shape of their courtship, blade after blade laid side by side for comparison, each one a little more a fusion of her clan's methods and his than the last, until it became difficult to say whose work was whose at all. They kissed more than once beside that forge, hungry and unhurried by turns, her strength and his steadiness meeting each other with a heat that neither the coals nor the sea wind could cool. But Murak, for all her boldness, held one part of herself carefully back, and Simon, patient as the tide, did not push her to explain why, not yet. It was the arrival of a stranger on the causeway, 3 months into her freedom, that finally forced the truth of it into the open. He came at dusk, walking the exposed stones with the confidence of one who had studied the tide tables carefully, a tall orc warrior in dark clan leathers with a curved blade at his hip, and the particular scarred tattoos of the Mudborn warband across his forearms. Murak went rigid at the sight of him from the smithy doorway, her hammer lowering slowly in her grip. Caitharg, she said, and there was no warmth in the name at all. The warrior stopped a respectful distance from the forge, though his eyes, dark and assessing, moved over Simon with open contempt before returning to Murak. The clan believed you dead or worse, Mudborn. I have spent 2 moons tracking rumors of a Mudborn bladesmith living free among humans. I did not believe them until now. Now you have found me, Murak said. Say your business and be gone before the tide traps you here with company you clearly despise. My business is the clan's honor, Caitharg said. You were taken alive in battle. Among our people, that is a stain that must be scoured clean, either by a champion's death in the pit or by a full season's penance at the war camp forges, proving your worth was not broken along with your spear arm. The elders sent me to bring you back for judgment. What I did not expect," and here his lip curled with real disgust, "was to find you keeping a human's bed as though you had forgotten what you are." Simon stepped forward at that, and Murak's hand shot out, not to restrain him from fear of Catharg's blade, but from fear of what the warrior's words might make him believe of himself, that he was a shameful secret rather than a chosen thing. "I have forgotten nothing," Murak said, cold and clear. "I remember exactly what I am. I am the woman who chose to live rather than die pointlessly on a battlefield already lost. I am the smith who has forged 3 blades finer than anything left in the war camp's cooling racks. And I am the woman who will decide for herself whether penance or pit or neither is owed. Not you, and not elders who were not there when the spear went through my shoulder. The clan will not accept a Mudborn who has lain with a human," Catharg said, and his hand drifted, meaningfully, toward the hilt at his hip. "There are older customs than penance for that. Come now, before I am forced to drag you." "You are welcome to try," Murak said, and lifted her hammer with a calm that Simon found more frightening than any shout of rage could have been. "But you should know that I have grown quite fond of this forge, and I do not care to see it damaged by your blood." Catharg's gaze flicked once more to Simon, weighing him the way a man weighs an obstacle rather than a person. "The human is nothing," he said. "I did not come to fight a smith for sport. I came for you, Murak. Choose wisely." The clan's patience for this insult has a season's length no more. When it runs out, they will not send 1 warrior. They will send 20, and they will not ask politely. He turned and walked back across the darkening causeway without another word, timing his steps with the precision of long practice, vanishing into the dusk before the tide could close around him, and left behind him a silence on Saltcairn heavier than any storm. "A season," Simon said finally, quietly. "What happens when the season ends, Murak?" "I do not know," Murak admitted, and it was the first time he had heard true uncertainty in her voice since the day he bought her chain. "My clan does not make idle threats. 20 warriors could take this headland in an hour if they came at night with fire." "Then we should not wait for them to choose the hour," Simon said, and there was a steel in his voice now that matched anything he had ever hammered into a blade. "Whatever comes, Murak, I am not sending you away to face it alone, and I am not letting anyone drag you off this rock while I still draw breath." Murak looked at him for a long moment in the gathering dark, the forge fire painting gold along the strong line of his jaw, and felt something crack open in her chest that she had guarded fiercely since the day the spear had taken her down on a lost battlefield and taught her that even the strongest could fall. "You are a fool, Simon Sullivan," she said, but her voice had gone soft, "and I have never in my life been so glad of a man's foolishness." They did not have to wait a full season. It took only 11 days. Murak woke first, some animal instinct honed by years of war camp life pulling her from sleep before any human ear could have caught the sound. A faint scrape of a boat's hull against the rocks below the headland where no honest fisherman would land at such an hour. She was on her feet and reaching for the hammer she kept always within arm's reach before Simon had even stirred, and her hand on his shoulder brought him instantly awake, trained by months of coastal living to trust the urgency in her touch. "Boats," she whispered. "More than one. This is not Catharg alone." They moved through the dark cottage without lighting a lamp, Simon pulling on his boots and reaching for the heavy smithing tongs that had become, in recent months, as much a weapon in his hands as a tool. While Murak belted on the curved blade she had forged with her own hands weeks before, a blade that had never yet tasted anything but a testing block of oak. Through the shuttered window, in the thin light of a clouded moon, they could see shapes moving up from the rocky shoreline where the causeway met the headland, a dozen at least, some in the dark leathers of Orc warband scouts, others in the mismatched armor of hired human mercenaries, torches unlit for stealth but blades bare and gleaming. "Not just your clan," Simon breathed. "Look there, the man with the crossbow, that is Vance's colors on his sleeve." He did not forgive losing the bid, Murak said grimly. He must have joined coin to Catharg's warriors, human greed married to orc grievance. A poor match, but an effective one if it kills us both. There was no time for a longer plan than the one instinct handed them. The forge itself, its great stone chimney and thick timber walls, was the most defensible ground on the headland, and Murak was already moving toward it, snatching up a length of iron rod still warm from the evening's banked coals as she went, while Simon grabbed the lantern and a coil of chain from the wall pegs. They reached the forge as the first raiders crested the headland's rise, and Murak did not wait for words or challenges. She met the foremost attacker, an orc scout half her size in armor but quick with a hand axe, and turned his first swing aside with the flat of her blade before driving her elbow into his throat with a force that dropped him choking to the ground. Simon was beside her a heartbeat later, swinging the heavy tongs in a wide arc that caught a mercenary's sword arm and sent his blade spinning into the dark, following through with a shove that sent the man tumbling back down the rocky slope with a cry. "Back to the forge door," Murak called. "Narrow ground, they cannot flank us there." They fought their way backward together, step for step, her blade and his tongs and hammer weaving a defense that neither of them had ever practiced, but that fit together with an instinct born of months spent learning each other's rhythms at the anvil. Where Murak's strength broke a guard, Simon's steadiness finished the strike. Where a raider tried to slip past her reach, Simon's bulk was there to block the gap, his own fear for her sharpening every swing into something fiercer than he had known himself capable of. A crossbow bolt sang past Murak's ear and buried itself in the timber doorframe, close enough that she felt the wind of its passing, and she snarled and hurled the iron rod in her offhand with a force that struck the crossbowman square in the chest and dropped him gasping into the mud. Simon, meanwhile, had reached the forge's cold water-quenching trough, and with a grunt of effort tipped it over entirely, sending a wave of icy water sweeping across the raider's feet and extinguishing the one torch that had finally been lit, plunging the melee back into confusing darkness that favored the defenders who knew the ground. It was in that darkness that Catharg found them, his blade already singing toward Murak's unguarded side, and it was Simon who saw the strike coming and threw himself into its path, catching the edge of the blow across his forearm rather than let it find Murak's ribs. He cried out, more in shock than pain, but did not fall, and Murak's roar of fury at the sight of his blood was loud enough to still even the raiders shouting for a heartbeat. "You dare!" she snarled at Catharg, and there was nothing left in her voice of the composed woman who had faced him calmly at the forge door 11 days before. There was only a warband smith's fury unleashed at last, and she came at him with a series of strikes so fast and so brutal that Catharg, for all his training, found himself giving ground, then stumbling, then finally sprawling backward over a fallen comrade with Murak's blade at his throat before he could recover his footing. "Call them off," she said, breathing hard, "or I finish what your elders started when they sent you to threaten a woman in her own home." Whether it was her blade at his throat or the sight of his remaining warriors and Vance's mercenaries, bloodied and routed by two defenders they had expected to overwhelm with ease, Catharg raised a hand and barked a command in the clan tongue. The surviving raiders, perhaps 8 of the original dozen still standing, began a hasty retreat back down toward their boats, dragging their wounded with them, and within minutes the headland had gone quiet again, but for the surf and Simon's ragged breathing. Murak let Catharg up only far enough to shove him bodily toward the retreating boats. "Tell your elders," she called after him, "that Murak Mudborn is not theirs to summon or to punish. Tell them I have found a life worth defending, and I will defend it against 20 warriors or 200, and I will not lose." Catharg said nothing, only cast one last unreadable look back at the headland before vanishing down the dark slope after his men, and Murak turned at once to Simon, all her battle fury collapsing instantly into raw fear as she saw the blood soaking his sleeve. "Let me see," she said, already tearing the fabric away with careful, urgent hands, and found the cut long but shallow, a graze that had bled fiercely but missed the deeper vessels of the arm entirely. Relief made her knees weak in a way that 30 raiders never had. "You threw yourself in front of a blade for me," she said, half furious and half something far softer, as she worked to bind the wound with strips torn from her own shirt. "You would have done the same for me," Simon said, wincing but steady, and probably with less complaining about it. "I am allowed to complain," Murak said. "You are mine to protect as much as I am yours, Simon Sullivan, and you keep forgetting that." The word hung between them in the ringing quiet after battle, mine, spoken without hesitation or embarrassment, and Simon looked up at her, blood-streaked and fierce and more beautiful to him in that moment than any woman he had ever imagined might look at him twice, let alone claim him as her own. "Say that again," he said quietly. "You are mine," Murak said, and this time it was not an accident of battle heat, it was deliberate, a claim laid down with full intention. "I have known it for weeks and been too proud or too afraid to say it plainly. I am done being afraid, Simon. I want you. Not as a keeper wants a pet, not as a woman grateful for rescue wants her rescuer. I want you as an equal, as a partner at my forge and in my life, for as long as the tide keeps coming in and going out." Simon Sullivan, bleeding and exhausted on the ground of a battlefield that had nearly claimed them both, felt something in his chest swell so large he could hardly breathe around it. He had spent so many years alone on this headland, overlooked by the town across the water, unremarkable in every way that mattered to the world beyond his forge. And here was this magnificent, fearless woman who could have chosen anyone, who could have walked away from every human who had ever wronged her kind, telling him plainly that she had chosen him. "I love you," he said, the words simple and unpracticed and entirely true. "I think I have loved you since you told me my coal storage was an insult to good craftsmanship." Murak laughed, a wet, startled sound, and leaned down to kiss him there among the wreckage of the fight, careful of his wounded arm but not at all careful of her own heart anymore. And the kiss they shared was hungrier and more certain than anything that had passed between them before, a claiming as much as a comfort, sealed in blood and firelight and the retreating sound of the tide. It was 3 days later, once Simon's arm had begun to knit, and the headland had been cleared of the debris of battle, that Murak came to him in the smithy at dusk with a small, sharp forging knife in her hand, and a gravity in her golden eyes that told him this was no ordinary evening. "I have been thinking of Catharg's words," she said, "about what my clan would and would not accept. I do not care what they would accept, but I find that I want something more than simply living beside you, Simon. I want to be bound to you in the way of my people, not because I need their approval, but because I want the truth of what we are between us to be marked in something more permanent than words." Simon set down the blade he had been polishing, giving her his full attention. "Tell me what that means. I do not know your customs, Murak. I only know that whatever you ask, I want to give it." Murak turned the small knife over in her scarred fingers, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something older and more solemn than her usual bluntness, the cadence of ritual words passed down through generations of her clan. "Among my people, a marriage is not sworn with pretty phrases spoken before a priest or a crowd," she said. "Words are cheap, Simon. Any man can promise anything with his tongue and break that promise the moment it becomes inconvenient. My clan's vows require a wound, not a word. Each partner offers their palm, and the other cuts it not deeply, but enough to draw true blood, and then the two wounds are pressed together so the blood mingles and the two become, in the clan's eyes and in truth, one bonded pair. The pain is meant to remind us, every time we look at the scar afterward, that love that costs nothing is worth nothing. A bond sealed only in comfortable words can be unsealed just as easily. A bond sealed in shared pain endures, because you have already proven in that single moment that you are willing to bleed for the other." She looked up at him then, searching his face for any flicker of hesitation, any human squeamishness at the idea of a wound freely given rather than a ring exchanged or a vow spoken before witnesses. It is not a small thing I am asking, Simon. There is no undoing it, not in the eyes of my people, and I would not offer this to you lightly, or expect you to accept lightly either. You may refuse. Words alone, spoken in the human way, would still mean everything to me, coming from you. Simon Sullivan did not hesitate. He did not ask how deep the cut needed to be, did not ask whether it would scar, did not ask any of the questions a more careful, more frightened man might have asked. He simply held out his open palm to her, steady as an anvil, his soot-stained, work-scarred hand turned upward in the last light of the dying forge fire. "Then cut," he said. "I would rather bleed for something true than live safe and untouched by anything that mattered. Take my palm, Murak. It is already yours along with the rest of me. It has been yours since the day you told me my coal was wet." Murak stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, and Simon saw something break loose in her expression. Some final wall she had kept standing even through all their months together. Some last guarded piece of herself that had perhaps still expected, on some deep animal level, for a human to flinch from true orc custom when it finally came time to prove himself. He had not flinched. He had not even paused to think about it. He had simply offered himself, whole and unhesitating, the moment she asked. "You do not even know how deep the cut must run," she said, her voice rough with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "I know it does not matter," Simon said. "Cut, Murak. I am not afraid of you, and I am not afraid of this." She took his hand in both of hers, gentle despite the terrible strength she carried in every finger, and turned it palm up beneath the dying firelight. The small knife she held had been forged by her own hand weeks before, tested against oak and iron and found true, and now she brought its edge to the meat of his palm below the thumb, and drew it across in one clean, careful line, deep enough to well immediately with dark blood, shallow enough that no true harm would come of it beyond the scar it would leave behind. Simon did not cry out. He watched his own blood rise with a strange, fierce satisfaction, as though the pain of it were proof of something he had wanted to prove for a very long time, that he was capable of being chosen, capable of being worth a wound freely given and freely taken. Then he took the knife from her hand, gently, and it was his turn to draw the blade, carefully, across the leathery green skin of her own palm. And though her skin was tougher than his by far, he saw her breath catch at the sting of it, saw the dark green-tinged blood well up to match his own, and understood in that moment exactly what she had meant about pain and endurance, because his hand shook slightly at the act of hurting her even for a purpose she had asked for, even knowing it was necessary. And that trembling told him more about the depth of his own love than any word could have. "Now," Murak said softly, and pressed her wounded palm to his, blood mingling warm and slick between them, her strong fingers lacing through his own until their two hands were bound together as surely as any rope or ring could have bound them. "Now you are Mudborn marked, Simon Sullivan, whether any clan elder ever acknowledges it or not. This is not a word that can be unsaid in an argument or forgotten in anger. This is written on both our bodies now forever." "Then I am glad of it," Simon said, his voice thick, "because I never wanted an easy word from you, Murak. I wanted this. I wanted to be chosen by you in a way that costs something because you are worth every drop." They stood together in the dying forge light for a long while after, hands still pressed and bleeding and bound, neither of them speaking, because there was nothing left that words could add to what had just passed between them. And when at last they did draw apart to bind each other's wounds with careful, tender hands, the silence between them was not empty, but full of a peace that neither of them had known they were capable of feeling until that exact moment. The scar it left, when it healed weeks later, was a thin, pale line across each of their palms, barely noticeable to a stranger's eye, but Murak found herself tracing it with her thumb at odd, quiet moments, marveling every time at the fact that this ordinary, soot-armed human man had offered himself to her clan's oldest and most binding custom without a heartbeat's hesitation. When warriors twice his size among her own people might have quailed at the thought of a blade drawn across their own flesh for love's sake. Word of the bonding and of the battle that preceded it traveled fast along the coast road, as such stories always did, and it was inevitable that it would reach both Bridgewatch's gossiping market stalls and, eventually, the ears of the Mudborn war camp itself. Caitharg, humiliated by his defeat and stripped of some rank for his failure, did not return, but word came instead, some 6 weeks later, that the clan elders themselves, curious and displeased in equal measure, intended to send a full delegation to Bridgewatch's spring trade fair, ostensibly to renew an old grazing treaty with the border lords. But in truth, everyone understood to look upon the mud-born daughter who had bonded herself to a human blacksmith and decide, once and for all, what was to be done about the scandal. Simon and Murak did not run from the confrontation. Murak insisted, in fact, on meeting it head-on in the open square of the very trade fair where the elders would be watching, rather than allow the matter to fester in whispers and shadowed threats for another season. "If they mean to judge us," she said, "let them judge us in the light before every eye that has ever doubted us, human and orc alike. I am done hiding what I am, and I am done letting others decide it for me." The spring trade fair filled Bridgewatch's square with color and noise the day the Mudborn delegation arrived. 3 elder orcs in ceremonial furs, flanked by a dozen warriors, walking with the deliberate dignity of a people unused to being kept waiting. Lord Vance, too, had come to observe the treaty renewal, and Murak noted with grim satisfaction that his gaze upon her now held wariness rather than the old contempt. A man who had learned, however unwillingly, that she was not livestock to be casually claimed. Simon walked beside her into the square, his bandaged palm long since healed to a thin white scar, his shoulders squared despite the weight of dozens of curious, hostile, and openly gawking stares from townsfolk who had never expected to see their reclusive blacksmith return with an orc woman on his arm as though she belonged there, which, as far as Simon was concerned, she absolutely did. The eldest of the Mudborn delegation, a scarred and silver-tusked orc woman named Graka, stepped forward from her guards to meet them in the square's center, her dark eyes moving from Murak to Simon and back again with an unreadable weight of judgment. "Murak, daughter of the Mudborn line," Graka said, her voice carrying easily over the hushed crowd, "you were taken alive in battle, a stain unscoured. And now you stand before your own elders bonded, by the old blood vow itself if the scars on your palms speak true to a human. Explain yourself, or face the judgment the clan has traveled far to deliver." The crowd of Bridgewatch townsfolk, drawn by the spectacle, pressed closer, their murmurs a low, ugly undercurrent of their own, some jeering at the orcs entirely, others jeering at Murak specifically for daring to stand so boldly among them. And for one tense moment it seemed as though the square might tip into violence from either direction, human prejudice and orc tradition both converging on the same 2 people who wanted nothing more than to be left to love each other in peace. Murak did not shrink from either crowd. She stepped forward, chin high, and lifted her scarred palm for every eye in the square to see, orc and human alike. "I was taken alive because the battle was already lost and further death would have served no one," she said, her voice ringing clear across the stunned quiet that fell as she spoke. "I do not regret surviving. I have never regretted it less than I do standing here today. This man," and she reached back to take Simon's hand, lacing her scarred fingers through his scarred fingers, palm to palm exactly as they had stood the night of their bonding, "spent every coin he owned to free me from a market that treated me as livestock, stood beside me against raiders sent by both a human lord's greed and my own clan's misplaced honor, and offered his own blood without a moment's hesitation when I told him what our bonding would cost him. Tell me, Elder Graka, which of your warriors would have done the same without flinching?" Tell me which among your delegation has proven, in blood and battle and unbroken loyalty, half so much devotion as this ordinary human man has shown me." The square had gone utterly silent, both crowds caught between fascination and discomfort, and Elder Graka's dark eyes studied Simon Sullivan for a long, considering moment, taking in his bandaged history written in scars, his steady stance, the way he had not once let go of Murak's hand through the entire confrontation, despite the danger surrounding them both. "You offered your palm," Graka said finally, addressing Simon directly for the first time, "knowing our custom demands the blood be genuine, the pain unfeigned. Most humans, even those who claim to love our women, balk at such a price. Why did you not?" Simon Sullivan looked at Murak, not at the elder, when he answered, because his answer had never truly been meant for the clan at all. "Because she is worth more than any wound I could offer," he said simply. "Because she chose me, out of every man who might have wanted her, and a woman like that deserves to know, beyond any possible doubt, that I would bleed for her without a moment's hesitation and would again, and will keep doing so for as long as I live. That is not a burden to me, Elder. It is the greatest honor of my life." Silence held the square a moment longer, and then Elder Graka did something none of the watching crowd expected. She laughed, a short, surprised, almost approving bark of sound, and turned to her fellow elders with a shake of her silver-tusked head. "The old customs are not so easily mocked as I feared," she said. "A wound freely given without hesitation is the truest proof our vows require. I have seen orc warriors flinch from less. This human has passed a test that would break lesser men of either blood." She turned back to Murak. "The stain of your capture is scoured, daughter of Mudborn, not by penance in a war camp forge, but by the far harder trial of proving your bond worth defending in blood before witnesses of both our peoples. I cannot say the clan will embrace your human husband with open arms in every camp you visit. Old prejudices die slowly on both sides of this divide. But I will not stand here and call your bond false when I have seen with my own eyes what it cost you both to forge it." A ripple of surprised muttering ran through the orc delegation, some clearly displeased, but none willing to challenge their eldest's judgment openly in so public a square. It was the human crowd's reaction that mattered most to Simon in that moment, though, and he felt his heart clench as he turned to find the dockworker with the hook-scarred cheek, standing near the front of the gathered townsfolk, the very man who had spat at Murak's feet months before, his face twisted now not in triumph, but in something closer to grudging, uncomfortable reconsideration. "Well," Lord Vance said into the lingering silence, his voice thin with the effort of maintaining composure before a crowd that had just watched him thoroughly humbled, "it seems the border treaty can proceed without further incident. I shall leave you to your domestic matters, blacksmith." He turned his horse and departed the square with as much dignity as he could muster, and his hasty retreat seemed to break something loose in the crowd's collective tension, scattered laughter rippling through both human and orc onlookers at his expense, the ugly mood of moments before dissolving into something almost festive. Murak Mudborn turned to Simon Sullivan there in the center of the square, before elders and townsfolk and warriors and merchants alike, before every eye that had ever doubted the two of them belonged together, and she did not wait for permission from anyone, clan or crown or crowd. "They tried to keep us apart," she said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, her golden eyes bright with fierce and open joy. "Human prejudice on one side, clan tradition on the other, and neither of them understood a single thing about what we have built between us." "Not a single thing," Simon agreed, grinning up at her, soot-armed and unremarkable and utterly, radiantly happy. "Then let them watch," Murak said, "and let them finally understand." She kissed him there in the square, in front of Elder Graka and the Mudborn delegation, in front of Lord Vance's retreating back, in front of the hook-scarred dockworker, and every gossiping merchant and fisherman who had ever whispered ugly words about an orc walking free beside a human blacksmith, kissed him deep and unhurried and utterly unashamed, her strong arms wrapping around him as his hands rose to cradle her face, and for one long, sun-warmed moment, the noisy square of Bridgewatch's spring fair fell entirely silent around them, as though the whole world had paused to witness two proud, stubborn, scarred hearts finally, defiantly, claiming each other in the open where no one could ever again pretend it was not real. When at last they broke apart, breathless and laughing, it was Elder Graka who spoke first into the hush, her tusked mouth curved in something that might, on another day, have been mistaken for warmth. "The old vows hold," she declared, loud enough for every witness to hear. "Blood was offered and blood was given, and no word spoken before a crowd could bind two hearts more surely than what I have seen here today. Let it be known among all who hear of this, human and orc alike, that Murak Mudborn stands wed by the truest vow our people know, to a man who did not hesitate." A cheer rose from some unexpected quarter of the crowd then. A few Bridgewatch fishermen who had grown fond of the blacksmith over years of honest dealings, and it caught, spreading unevenly but genuinely through the square, human voices and orc voices raised together in something that, for one bright afternoon at least, resembled celebration rather than division. They returned to Saltcairn that evening as the tide crept in behind them, hand in scarred hand, the forge waiting cold and patient for their return, and Murak Mudborn paused at the narrow spine of the causeway, the same spot where she had first kissed him with the sea rising around their ankles, and looked back at the mainland one more time before the water closed the road behind them for the night. "No more running," she said. "No more hunters on our trail, no more elders questioning our worth. Only this, Simon, only us and the tide and the forge for as long as we both wish it." "For as long as we both wish it," Simon agreed, drawing her hand up to press a kiss against the pale scar on her palm, "which, as far as I am concerned, means forever." Murak Mudborn, who had once stood chained upon an auction block expecting nothing from the world but cruelty, looked at the soot-armed, steady-hearted, unremarkable man who had offered his palm without a moment's hesitation, and changed the entire shape of her life with that single act of courage, and found that forever, for the first time, did not sound like a burden or a fear. It sounded, standing there on the wind-scoured spine of stone between two worlds that had once tried so hard to keep them apart, exactly like home. They walked the rest of the way together as the last of the daylight faded over Saltcairn, the forge fire waiting to be rekindled, the sea singing its old, unchanging song around the headland that was theirs now, wholly and completely, and neither of them looked back again.